We've seen what diversification is, entering a new business. We've also seen how we can diversify, organic growth, alliances, or M&A. But when would we diversify? Here's the situation that we're facing. Let's say we're in a business A. We want to know if diversifying into business B creates more value. So what we want to do is we want to compare the old situation with the new situation where we're active in both business A and B. Let's break that down. The old situation is VA, that is the value of business A. The new situation is value of business A and B, so V of A and B. Now, importantly, we need to consider the cost of getting from the old situation to the new situation, which is here indicated by the cost of entering business B. So really what we're doing is we're comparing the old situation with the new situation while taking into account the transition from old to new. As you may have noticed, there's little M's on the slides. These refer to the growth mode. So the basic idea is that the cost of entering a business really depends on the growth mode that you choose. So if you enter through an organic mode, the cost of entry are really your internal investments. If you enter through an alliance, then the cost of entry are really the cost of setting up that alliance. If you're entering through an acquisition, it's really the additional cost that you pay for acquiring that company. Likewise, the value of businesses A and B together depend on the growth mode. So you can think of the value being created through an alliance might be very different than the value that's being created through an M&A. One key takeaway then is that when we compare the old with the new situation, we should do so for every growth mode separately. For precision, I'm offering you here a definition. The notation is not that important for you to remember. However, I do want you to remember the basic trade-offs. The first one is the trade-off between before and after. So what we're doing is we're comparing the initial situation, that the situation where we're just in business A, versus the situation where we are in both A and B. The second trade-off, or the second thing I want you to remember, is that we need to take into account the cost of entry. So it's not just sufficient thinking about what would be the end state once we're both in A and B, but it's also important to think about how do we get there. And then the last thing I want you to remember is the little m's, which refer to the growth mode. Basically, both the cost of entry and the value of being in both businesses together really depend on the growth mode. So again, don't worry if this notation doesn't come natural to you. It's really about the insight. So what's the key insight that we can take away from this? Well, it gives us the basic conditions for when to diversify. The decision to enter a new business depends on just two things. First, synergies, second, bargains. Let's start with synergies. We'll talk in more detail what synergies are, but that basically means that the value of operating both business A and B is higher if they're jointly operated than if they were operated separately. Thus, the higher the synergies, the more value from linking business A and B. The lower the synergies, the less value in linking business A and B. What we can see is that more synergies would make diversification more attractive. Now, if we link it back to our previous notation, then we can think about synergies relating to the V, the value of being in both business A and B, depending on the growth mode. The second dimension is bargains. A bargain is if you pay less for a business than what it's worth. If business B is a bargain, then you're more likely to enter. If the price of B is very high, then you're less likely to diversify. Again, we can link it back to our initial equation or our initial formula, and then bargaining cost is related to the cost of entry. If the cost of entry is less than the value of that business, you're more likely to enter that business. If you put both conditions together, you see clear implications. If you have and synergies and bargains, you're very likely to want to diversify. If, on the other hand, you don't have synergies and business B is not really a bargain, you're very unlikely to want to diversify. The implications are clear when both are no or both are yes. But oftentimes, one is going to be yes and the other is going to be no. Then a careful assessment is needed between the cost of entry and the synergies. We'll look at a systematic way of doing that. In the next video, we look more closely at synergies, which is one of the most important concepts in corporate strategy. In the last video, we saw that synergies is one of the key drivers of diversification. In fact, synergies is one of the most important constructs within all of corporate strategy. Unfortunately, it's also one of the biggest buzzwords within this domain and often misused by many people. I want to ensure that you have a good understanding of what synergies are and apply it correctly. Now, when I say synergies, what we're really going to do is look at operational synergies. We say that operational synergies exist if the value of two businesses operated together is worth more than the value of those businesses operated separately. Let's begin with an example. Here you see two businesses. One business produces toys for children. The other business produces plastic kitchenware. How can we create synergies between these businesses? In other words, how can we create more value to jointly operating these businesses? Well, one way is perhaps through the manufacturing facilities. Perhaps we can use the manufacturing facilities for kitchenware to also produce toys. One could then eliminate the manufacturing facilities for the toys, and you could produce the same with fewer. Hence, this would be one way to create potential value from jointly operating toys and kitchenware, specifically through manufacturing. Where do synergies come from? Because it's from joint operations, it must mean that the synergies arise from the value chain. If we look one step deeper, it's really about resources that underlie the value chain, because that's ultimately where the value comes from. Now, resources are the factors of production, classically defined as land, labor, and capital. More commonly, however, we think of these as such things as technologies, people, and manufacturing facilities. Many classification schemes for synergies exist out there. Unfortunately, they tend to take a financial perspective, which is helpful for financial analysts, but possibly not so helpful for us as managers or as corporate strategists. What we really care about is the operational side of things. We care about where synergies come from, what's their root cause. So what we did, together with my co-author Farnoosh Puranam, we developed our own classification scheme. We call it the 4Cs Synergies Framework. I'll guide you through it. The framework uses two dimensions: whether resources are similar or not, and the extent to which resources need to be modified to capture the synergies. We've seen an example of consolidation. In the toys and plastic kitchenware example, one could modify similar resources to eliminate redundancies. This is consolidation because it relates to similar resources, the manufacturing facilities, and to capture the synergies, one of the resources needed to be modified substantially if we are to close one of the facilities. There's three other types: combination, customization, and connection. Let's look at them in turn. This is an example of combination, pooling similar resources to achieve scale without the need of massive modification of those resources. We're going to look at the same business we did before, the toys business, but this time we're linking it with a different business, the drinking glasses business. So what we're interested in is how can we combine these businesses to create more value from jointly operating them? Well, one way could be by linking the procurement steps. Let's say drinking glasses, for their shipments, they use a lot of packaging and cardboard. If we say that toys need similar packaging or cardboard, perhaps we can combine our demand and get a better price from our supplier. So one way that we can possibly create value is by combining procurement of drinking glasses and the procurement step of toys. Now, unlike the previous example of consolidation, where we had to really change the resources, remember, we had to close one of the manufacturing facilities. Here, in this example of combination, it's fairly easy, in a relative sense, to combine the procurement step of drinking glasses with that of toys. It all comes down to simply giving a call to our supplier and say, hey, we're buying more from you. Can you give us a better price? The next example is connection. Pooling dissimilar resources to facilitate their joint use without the need for substantial modification of those resources. We're looking at the same business as before, the toys business, but this time we're thinking about ways to link it with a children's books business. Here's one way that we can connect these two businesses. Let's say children's books are currently being sold abroad, for which they have an international distribution network. Now let's say our toys business is only operating locally within our own home country. Now one way that we can connect these businesses is if we were to take these toys and sell them through the international distribution network of children's books. Basically what we're doing is we're connecting the sales segment or the distribution segment of toys to the international sales of children's book. Now we can say these are dissimilar resources because one is international and the other is not. And it's precisely because they are different that we want to connect them. The modification required, we can say, might not be that high because we will be using the existing resource without much need for modification. Hence, we would say this is an example of connection. The last example is customization, linking different resources to make them work better together with the need of substantial modification. We're looking again at our toys business. This time we want to link it with a consumer electronics business. The question that we have is, can we customize one or both of the resources to make them work better together? Here's one way. Let's say we want to link the R&D of both businesses. Let's further assume consumer electronics has some interesting speech recognition software. Unfortunately, it's been tested on children and it doesn't pick up the children's voices very well. Luckily, the R&D of toys knows very well how children speak and behave. Perhaps there's some value of linking these two R&D resources. Now, linking them is not sufficient. We actually need to modify them, we need to enhance them, we need to improve them in order to create value. One way of creating value by linking these businesses is by linking the R&D segments. Now, this is an instance of customization because we're dealing with dissimilar resources. On the one hand, the speech recognition software, on the other hand, the knowledge about children's voices and behavior. The second criteria for customization is enhancement or modification. Here, we need to enhance or modify the R&D resources in order to create value. An example of customization. We now have a better understanding of what synergies are and how we can classify them. But just one tip, think about these dimensions, similarity of resources and the extent of modification. These are continuous. It might not be all or nothing. In that case, it might be difficult for us to classify a given synergies neatly in one of these 4 boxes. That's totally fine. Don't worry about that. In fact, the goal of the 4Cs framework and its emphasis on value chain and resources is not about classifying synergy, it's really about seeking synergies. Then what we call a given synergy is of much, much lesser importance. We've seen the basic ingredients to a diversification decision. We started off by thinking about how to diversify, whether you should do inorganic growth or organic growth. And then within inorganic, we thought about alliance versus acquisition. We also looked at the conditions for diversification, especially bargains versus synergies. If you have both, great. If you have neither, better not to diversify. And if you have just one of them, we needed a careful assessment. Then as a last point, we realized that it's difficult or impossible to think about the question of whether you should diversify independently of how to diversify. You really need to think about them at the same time. How can we link all of this? I'm going to take you through a 5-step approach that takes into account each of these considerations and help you make a diversification decision. These are the 5 practical steps. First, finding synergies. Second, identifying resource gaps. This is basically to what extent do we already have the resources for the new business and which resources are still missing. Those that are missing, we either need to build or borrow from someone else. Third, identifying candidates. Who could we potentially team up with to enter that new business? Fourth, ally or acquire. We need to compare the different modes. It turns out that it's easiest to start with the inorganic modes. So we first need to identify the best inorganic mode, whether that is ally or acquire. 5, organic or inorganic growth. We need to compare the best inorganic growth mode with the organic mode. In the next set of videos, we're going to discuss each step in turn. This should allow you to apply these 5-step procedures to evaluate or recommend a diversification move. We're now going to discuss the 5-step approach to a diversification decision. And the first step is finding synergies. We've seen that synergies is a key driver of diversification, so we need a systematic way to find and identify them. We want to find synergies. Because we're looking at operational synergies, it means that we have to look at the value chain. A value chain is a series of activities that are necessary to produce and deliver a product to your customers. We can actually link this very easily to our initial description of a business in terms of its who, what, how. We can say that a value chain is a description of the how. It's a series of activities that brings or produces a product and brings it to your customers. So the output of a value chain is really a product in terms of the what delivered to customers, the who. The important point here is that synergies are really in the how, not necessarily in the what or the who. We're looking at operations, we're looking at the how. So you may have heard of an unsolved matrix when thinking about diversification. What that really is doing is comparing the products and customers in the current situation with the new situation. So it's a 2x2 matrix with on the axis customers and products. For each of these, you can think about existing and new. So existing customers and new customers. Likewise, existing products and new products. I find this framework useful to communicate a diversification decision because it neatly captures whether you're entering a business that with the same products or different products, with new customers or the same customers. However, I do not find it useful to decide on a diversification move, and the reason is the following. What it really does is comparing the what and the who. We've just seen that the synergies are not in the what and who, rather they're in the how. So one way to see it, customers really is the who, products really is the what. If our diversification is based on synergies, then we cannot infer from this matrix where we should go. Let's walk through an example. Let's say you're working for a sports car manufacturer, for example the nice Ferrari that you see here, and your boss has identified the theme parks business as a potentially attractive business to diversify into. How can we decide whether this move would be good or not? You might think that this example is a bit far-fetched. I certainly think so. But The example will help us think through the different steps. So how do we start? Begin with drawing value chains of the existing business, in this case that's a sports car business, and the value chain for the new business, in this case the theme parks business. Note that you can draw a value chain of a generic business or one that is specific to the partner. At this stage, it doesn't really matter that much. The value chains can be quite crude. Just take 3 to 7 steps, which is oftentimes enough detail for us to do the analysis. And notice that we're mixing here primary and support activities. That might be okay for the purposes of our diversification analysis. The goal is structured speculation. So even a crude value chain will help us achieve that goal. We want to run the following thought experiment. Could you justify paying a premium for an acquisition of a well-performing theme park business? At this stage, we're not saying that we're going to do an acquisition, but we just want to say, if we were to do an acquisition, where would the value come from? If we find it difficult to think about what the sources of value would come from, then that's a clear indication that a diversification move is not suitable. The question that we're really asking is, where are the synergies? I'm going to do some speculation here. You may find some synergies more plausible than others, but that's precisely the point. We want to really see where the value potentially could be. I'm going to focus on 3. Let's begin with R&D. Perhaps we as a Ferrari company or a sports car business can help build a new theme park. I think that's a little bit far-fetched, but perhaps there's some knowledge that we have as a sports car manufacturer that could be helpful in theme park business. Again, I'm a bit doubtful, but I'm just putting it out there. The next one, branding, is I think more plausible. Perhaps we could take our brand, the Ferrari brand, and apply it to a new theme park business. If our brand is very strong, people might want to go to the new theme park business because it's associated with our sports car business. This would be a connection type of synergy. And for the last step, maybe there's some value from linking sales with service delivery. Now, service delivery of a theme parks is very different than the sales of a sports car, but maybe we can do some connection type of synergies where we sell our sports car in the theme parks. Perhaps it's a bit unlikely because you would think that buying a sports car is not really an impulse purchase, but again, I'm just putting it out there. If you want to think about the synergies between these two businesses, these would be some of the places where you would start. Now we know if we were to link these two businesses, where the value would come from. If you have difficulty identifying any value, you know that a potential diversification move will have to be justified on the grounds of it being a bargain, the price being very, very low. Let's move to the next step in our 5-step diversification approach. So we're looking at the diversification decision, entering a new business. In the previous video, we looked at identifying synergies between the existing and the new business. The next step for us is to identify resource gaps. Here are the 5 steps. We did step 1, synergies. Let's do step 2, resource gaps. The basic question that we're addressing is, if we enter the new business, do we have the resources required to run that business? Now we can think about 2 extremes. On the one end, we have no resources required for the new business. That basically means that the resource gap is big and we need to either build up those resources or partner with someone else. On the other side, it could be that we already have most, if not all, resources required. In that case, the resource gap is small. Now let's think back to our initial example of Finish Post diversifying into the lawn mowing business. The key resource there was the mail delivery service personnel. And it was precisely that they had excess capacity, they had low volume days, that they could easily shift their activities from mail delivery to lawn mowing. So in that specific instance, the resource gap was small and they found it very easy to enter the lawn mowing business. Let's look at our earlier example, sports cars diversifying into theme parks. Now, we need to think about what resources does the sports car business already have that can be used or applied in the new business, theme parks. We can go through it step by step. Now, you'll soon realize that these businesses are quite different, which probably means that the resources required could be very, very different as well. Now, if we think about R&D, the first step, there might be very little that we can actually leverage from the sports car business into the theme cars business. We thought about maybe applying the knowledge about how to design a car could also potentially be useful about theme parks, but there's a whole lot more to it. So perhaps we can say sports cars has a little bit of the R&D required for theme cars business, but within that activity, there's still some gap. So we can say there's somewhat of a resource gap even within R&D. Now for procurement and manufacturing is very clear. Sports car has very little to do with theme parks. So we think that these resource gaps are going to be substantial in each of these activities. The next one is an interesting one, branding. Think back to our earlier synergy example. We figured out that perhaps branding is the most valuable of all the synergies that we identified. And the reason it was the most valuable is because we thought we could fairly easily reapply the brand of the sports car, of the Ferrari, onto the theme parks. If that's the case, we say that the resource gap in branding is low. So the last step is service delivery. Now this step is very different than anything a sports car business does. So again, we could say the resource gap is probably quite substantial in that segment. Hence, it would seem that a sports cars manufacturer has quite a big resource gap that needs to be filled before entering the theme park business. So if we think about the two extremes, on the one hand, already having most or all of the resources, and on the other hand, having very little resources that can be usefully applied in the new business, Ferrari is probably on the latter end. All of the remaining gaps need to be either filled organically or inorganically. To recap, in this step, we're looking at the additional resources required to enter a new business. On one hand, it could be that you have most of the resources. On the other hand, it could be that you have still quite a few resources that either need building or can be acquired or borrowed from someone else.